I want you to picture something for a moment. A quiet room, early in the morning, doing something small and ordinary, the kind of thing you've done 1,000 times without thinking about it. It's not dramatic. Nobody's crying. Nothing's on fire. There's no emergency to point to. It's just quiet. The kind of quiet that used to mean peace, and somewhere along the way started meaning something closer to. Before I go any further, if you're new here, welcome, and if any part of what I've said so far already sounds like something you needed to hear, go ahead and hit that subscribe button now, because I don't want you to lose track of this channel before we get to the part of the story that actually matters most. I say that not because I need the number to go up for its own sake, though of course that helps keep this going, but because I've heard from enough people by now to know that these stories tend to find the people who need them at exactly the moment they need them, sometimes long after they first subscribed, scrolling back through late at night during a hard stretch, looking for something that says plainly, "You are not the only person who has felt this way. If that ends up being you someday, I want to make sure this is easy to find again." So take care of that now. It takes 2 seconds, and then let's keep going, because there's quite a bit more to this story, and I don't think the version I've told you so far does justice to where it actually ends up. I want you to picture something for me. You're sitting in a doctor's waiting room in Columbus, Ohio, and the fluorescent lights are doing that thing they do, where they hum just below the threshold of something you can actually complain about, and you've got a clipboard in your lap with a form asking you to list your emergency contact. And you get to that line and you just stop, because the person whose name you've written on that line for 43 years is gone, and you don't know whose name goes there now, and you sit there so long the receptionist has to come over and ask whether you need help, and you tell her no, and you write down your daughter's name in handwriting that doesn't look like yours anymore because your hands aren't entirely steady, and you hand it back over the counter, and you go sit back down, and you stare at a wall, and you think, this is my life now, not as a low point, just as a Wednesday. My name is Wyatt. I'm 71 years old, and 14 months ago I stepped off a plane in Manila with 1 checked bag, 1 carry-on, and a Social Security and pension deposit that totals $1,400 a month. And I now live a life that I could not afford, could not even reasonably imagine affording, on the $5,500 a month I was pulling together back in Ohio, during what I had convinced myself were my comfortable years. If that sounds improbable to you, I understand completely, because it sounded improbable to me too, for much longer than it should have, and the only reason I'm here to tell you it's true is that a handful of specific things happened in a specific order, and I was just barely awake enough to pay attention when they did. Before I get into any of that, if this kind of story matters to you, go ahead and subscribe right now, because there's more of this coming, and I think you'll want to be here for it. I grew up in Dayton, Ohio, and I spent my entire working life inside maybe a 60-mile radius of where I was born, which is the kind of thing that doesn't feel like a limitation when you're inside it. It just feels like a life. I worked for the Ohio Department of Transportation for just over 31 years. Not a glamorous career, not the kind of work people ask about at dinner parties, but honest work, steady work, the kind of work that comes with a pension if you stick with it long enough and don't do anything catastrophically stupid, which I mostly managed. I married a woman named Carol when I was 26 years old, and we had 3 children together, a daughter named Melissa who lives in Cincinnati now, a son named Brett who's out in Portland, and a younger daughter named Jess who I was closest to, geographically and otherwise, living about 20 minutes away from the house Carol and I shared in a suburb outside Columbus called Westerville. Carol left the marriage when I was 54, which is a whole other story, and not one I'm going to spend much time on here, except to say that when a marriage of 28 years ends, and you are living in the house you both chose, and all the furniture and the dishes and the photographs are still exactly where they always were, the silence that comes into that house afterward is a specific, textured kind of silence that I don't think I have the words for even now, 17 years later. I never remarried, I dated a few people over the years, some nice women, nothing that took root the way it would have needed to, for me to consider changing much about how I was living. Mostly I just worked, and then I retired, and then I started figuring out, slowly and with considerable discomfort, that a life built almost entirely around a career you no longer have, and a marriage that ended 17 years ago, does not actually leave you with all that much, once both of those things are gone. My pension came in at $840 a month. Social Security added another $560, $1,400 total, every month, reliably, on the same schedule, and every single month I watched that $1,400 fail completely to cover what it cost to live in Westerville, Ohio, in a modest 3-bedroom house that I owned outright, meaning no mortgage, and still could not quite afford to maintain on what I was bringing in. Property taxes were $4,200 a year. Utilities in a house that old, and it was an old house, a 1978 ranch that I'd done my best with, but that leaked heat in winter like it had a philosophical objection to keeping me warm, ran easily $250 to $300 a month, just for gas and electric, from November through March. Car insurance, because you cannot live in suburban Ohio without a car and cannot drive a car without insuring it, was another $130 a month. Groceries, medications, the occasional house repair, the slow and steady accumulation of things that break when a house gets old and you are living in it alone, and there is nobody splitting any of these costs with you, all of it adding up, month after month, to a number that comfortably exceeded what was coming in. I was pulling from savings to cover the gap. I knew I was pulling from savings to cover the gap. I knew, with the specific and nauseating clarity of a man who spent 3 decades working for a state government and therefore has a functional relationship with spreadsheets, exactly how many years I could keep pulling from savings before the savings ran down to a number that would start to require a different kind of decision entirely. I had run those numbers. I had run them more than once. I had run them at the kitchen table in the morning over coffee, and I had run them again late at night when I couldn't sleep, which was most nights, and the number kept coming out to the same answer, which was that I was going to outlive my cushion somewhere around age 77 or 78, if nothing changed, and I continued living exactly as I was living, and then whatever came after that was going to require the kind of help I had spent my entire adult life trying not to need from my children. I want to talk about what my actual daily life looked like in Westerville, not the financial version of it, but the lived version, because I think the financial piece is actually the easier part to explain. Money is just numbers, and numbers make sense in a way that everything else is sometimes harder to describe. What my days looked like in Westerville was this. I woke up around 6:30, because I had woken up at 6:30 my entire adult life, and my body had simply decided that was when it was going to be awake, regardless of whether there was anywhere to be. I made coffee. I watched the news, which I had also done my entire adult life, and which had stopped informing me about anything useful, and had become purely a habit, a way of filling the kitchen with noise that wasn't me. I ate something, usually cereal or toast, standing at the counter, because sitting at the kitchen table alone felt, for reasons I could never quite articulate, slightly worse than standing at the counter. I had a list of things I might do on any given day, errands that needed running, yard work if the season called for it, maybe a visit to the library, maybe a drive over to see Jess and her kids on a weekend afternoon, if she had the time and I had the nerve to call and ask whether she did. And that was more or less it. Day after day after day, with occasional variations, a doctor's appointment here, a haircut there, a dinner with Jess's family on a Sunday that I looked forward to for the entire week beforehand and thought about for the entire day afterward, because it was, functionally, the primary social event of my week. I had friends, or I had people I called friends, men I'd worked with over the years, a couple of neighbors, but the particular kind of male friendship that most men my age have learned to maintain, which involves showing up in the same physical space at predictable intervals, and not talking about anything important, had started to feel, somewhere in my late 60s, like a transaction I was performing without quite believing in the currency anymore. I was not depressed, not clinically, not in a way that anyone who saw me regularly would have pointed to and said, "That man needs help." I was just quietly, persistently less alive than I had used to be, and the gap between who I was on the days when everything felt manageable and who I had been when I was working and raising kids and engaged with the world in some forward-facing way had grown wide enough that I sometimes looked at photographs from 10 or 15 years earlier. A birthday party, a Christmas gathering, something mundane and ordinary, and the person in those photographs looked like someone I used to know well and now only ran into occasionally. Jess was the one who first mentioned the Philippines. She's 38. She works in digital marketing. She has 2 boys who are 7 and 9, and who I would walk across broken glass for. And she has the particular quality that I've noticed in people who grew up watching the internet reshape the world around them, of simply not accepting that the options you're presented with are the only ones that exist. She called me one evening in late autumn, a Tuesday I think, and she said, "Dad, I've been watching these videos and reading these forums, and I need you to just listen to me for 10 minutes without telling me it's not realistic." I told her I was listening. She'd been reading about American retirees living abroad, specifically in the Philippines, and had gone fairly deep down the rabbit hole, reading forum posts and watching video accounts from people who were doing it, who had pensions in the same general range as mine, or sometimes smaller, and who were describing a life that sounded not just affordable, but genuinely full in ways that bore no resemblance to what I was describing to her on our weekly calls. She'd made notes. She read some of them to me. The cost of renting a decent apartment, the cost of food, the cost of healthcare. I listened, and I did not tell her it was not realistic, but I also did not say anything particularly enthusiastic. And when she was done, I said something careful and non-committal about how that was interesting, and she said, with the patience of a person who knows exactly what a non-committal response from their father sounds like, and what it actually means, "Dad, you're telling me you're going to keep eating cereal alone in that kitchen for the next 15 years. Will you please just look at this?" I told her I would look at it, and I did, eventually, though not right away. What I actually did right away was nothing, which is the honest answer. I let the conversation sit for about 3 weeks, the way you let a thing sit, when some part of you recognizes it might require you to change something you're not yet sure you're willing to change. I puttered around the house. I raked leaves, because it was November in Ohio, and the leaves required raking whether I was planning on moving to Southeast Asia or not. I thought about it the way you think about things you're not quite ready to look at directly, sideways and briefly, and then away again. And then something happened that made the sideways approach no longer available. My heating system failed, not gradually, not in a way that gave me warning, but entirely, overnight, on the coldest night of November, which in central Ohio is a meaningful statement. I woke up to a house that was 51 degrees, and a furnace that would not start, and a repairman who told me, after 45 minutes of examination, I was watching with the specific dread of a man who already knew the answer, that the heat exchanger was cracked, and the unit was 22 years old, and the honest conversation here was whether it made more sense to repair or replace. Replacing was $6,200. Repairing would buy me maybe another season before I was having this same conversation again, and that repair was $1,800. I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of tea I'd made on the stove, because it was one of those gas burners that lights with a match and didn't need the electricity. It happened without much warning, the way these things usually do, a sudden and frightening development that arrived in the middle of an otherwise ordinary stretch of time and, for a while, threatened to undo a lot of the confidence I'd built up about the choice I'd made. I remember the specific fear underneath the physical fear, which was less about the immediate situation and more about a question I hadn't fully let myself sit with before that moment. What happens now, this far from the people and systems I used to be able to lean on without a second thought? That question turned out to have a better answer than I'd feared. Help arrived faster than I expected. Care turned out to be more capable and more affordable than the version of it I'd carried around in my head, built mostly out of second-hand worry rather than actual information. I came out the other side of it shaken but fine, and with something I hadn't expected to gain from a frightening experience, which was a much clearer, calmer sense of what would actually happen if something went wrong again, replacing an abstract fear with concrete, reassuring knowledge. I think that's an underrated gift, honestly, the kind you only get by going through the hard version of a question instead of just wondering about it from a safe distance. I no longer had to imagine what an emergency would look like in this new life. I knew because I'd lived it, and the knowing turned out to be far less frightening than the not knowing had been. I now also didn't entirely trust, and I put on every layer I owned, and I looked at those two numbers, 1800 or 6200, and I thought, clearly, for the first time without flinching away from it, that I was spending real money, significant chunks of my limited savings, to maintain a life that I had just described to my daughter as eating cereal alone in a kitchen. That was the moment. Not a dramatic one. No volcano on the horizon. No photograph that rearranged my sense of what was possible. Just a man in 4 layers of clothing, doing arithmetic at a kitchen table, and arriving at a conclusion he'd been circling for months. I replaced the furnace, because I still needed to live somewhere warm while I figured out what happened next. And then I called Jess back, and I told her to send me everything she had. She sent me links, forum threads, a few YouTube accounts from people who had made the move and were documenting it, at least 2 long-form written accounts from men roughly my age who had moved to various parts of the Philippines on pensions in my range and were living what they described, with what seemed like genuine specificity rather than promotional gloss, as comfortable and socially full lives. I read everything. I read it over the course of about 2 weeks, at the kitchen table, in the evenings, in the middle of the night when I couldn't sleep, which was still most nights, and I built a picture. The picture looked like this. A decent 1-bedroom or small 2-bedroom apartment in a mid-sized Philippine city, not Manila proper, but one of the secondary cities or smaller towns that the forum writers consistently recommended for retirees, could be rented for somewhere between 12 and 20,000 pesos a month, which at the exchange rate I was looking at meant somewhere between $215 and $360. That was rent. Food, real food, cooked fresh, available from markets and small local restaurants every single day, ran for a retiree, eating reasonably, but not austerely, somewhere between $150 and $250 a month, depending on how often you cooked at home versus ate out. Utilities in a place that didn't require a furnace the size of a small car and wasn't fighting Ohio's willingness to drop to 0 degrees in February were, by every account I read, negligible in comparison. Typically $40 to $80 a month for electricity and water combined. I did the math. I did it repeatedly, the way I had done the Ohio math repeatedly, except this time the math was producing a different kind of answer. On $1,400 a month in the Philippines, with the cost structure I was reading about, I would not merely survive. I would have money left over, real money, actual discretionary income, the kind I hadn't had since I was working full-time and hadn't expected to ever see again on a fixed income. I could eat well, live in a comfortable place, maintain my medications, and still have $300 or $400 a month that didn't need to go anywhere in particular, which after years of watching my savings quietly bleed out, was a concept so foreign to my current life that I had to sit with it for a while to believe it was real. There was a visa program specifically designed for foreign retirees, called the Special Resident Retirees Visa, administered by the Philippines Retirement Authority. The requirements for someone my age were not complicated. a valid passport, a police clearance from your home country, medical clearance, a deposit into a Philippine bank, the amount varying based on age and whether you intended to use certain facilities. But for a retiree over 55, without specific add-on provisions, the required deposit was $10,000, money that remained yours and could be invested, not spent or forfeited. I had $10,000. Even after the furnace, I had $10,000, and the visa, once obtained, was permanent, renewable, allowing indefinite residence in the Philippines. I spent a month doing nothing but research, and I mean nothing but research. I joined expat forums and read through years of archived threads, the kind of granular, specific conversation between people actually living this life that no travel article ever provides. The details about which cities had the most established expat communities, which areas had reliable internet connections because I had a remote consulting arrangement I was still occasionally called on for, which neighborhoods were considered genuinely walkable, which hospitals the long-term foreign residents actually used and trusted. I read threads about healthcare with particular attention because I knew that was going to be the first and most serious objection from Melissa, from Brett, and especially from Jess, who had been the one to send me down this road in the first place, but who I knew would have concerns of her own once the abstract idea became a concrete plan with a departure date attached to it. I want to be fair about the healthcare question because I think it deserves a direct and honest answer, rather than a reassurance that skips over the legitimate concern. Philippine healthcare is not American healthcare, and I'm not going to tell you it is. What it is, in practical terms, is substantially less expensive, faster in many contexts, and considerably less of a bureaucratic nightmare than what I was dealing with in Ohio, where my insurance required prior authorizations for medications I had been taking for 6 years, and where I had waited 11 weeks for a specialist appointment for something that turned out to be nothing but that 11-week wait had allowed me to catastrophize into something significant. The major cities in the Philippines have internationally accredited hospitals. The doctors practicing in those hospitals are trained to standards that are genuinely recognized internationally, many of them trained at institutions in the United States or Europe before returning, and the cost of care is, by every account I could find from foreigners who had actually used it, a small fraction of American prices. I also took out an international health insurance policy specifically designed for retirees living abroad. This was not cheap relative to what I was spending on everything else in the Philippines, running me about $180 a month, but it covered emergency evacuation, major procedures, and hospitalization, and it gave me the specific, documented answer I needed ready when Melissa and Brett and Jess all asked the same question, which I knew they would, in exactly those words. What happens if something serious happens to you over there? I planned a trip. 2 weeks, to a city called Dumaguete on the island of Negros Oriental, which had come up repeatedly in the forums as one of the most established and recommended retirement destinations in the country. A small university city on the coast, with a settled expat community, a genuine local character of its own, and a cost of living at the lower end of what I'd been researching. A man named Gary, who I'd been exchanging messages with on one of the forums for about 6 weeks by that point, a 68-year-old retired engineer from Minnesota who'd been living in Dumaguete for 4 years, had offered to show me around for a few days if I made it out there, with the offhand generosity that I'd noticed characterized almost every exchange I'd had with people living this life, a willingness to be useful to a stranger who was earlier on the same road they'd traveled. I booked the trip without telling my children I was doing it. I want to be honest about that. I booked it first and told them after, because I knew that if I told them I was thinking about it before I had a ticket, the conversation would become about the idea, rather than about what I'd actually find when I got there, and I didn't have the patience for an extended theoretical debate about a question that could be answered much more efficiently by simply going and looking. Melissa was not pleased that I'd booked before telling her. Melissa is 43 and is, of my 3 children, the most like me in temperament, meaning she thinks in straight lines and does not especially appreciate it when other people, including her father, do not. She called me within about an hour of receiving my message, letting them know about the trip, and asked, in a tone I recognized from her teenage years as controlled patience on the edge of something less controlled, whether I had talked to my doctor before planning a long-haul flight and a 2-week trip to a country I had never visited, and I told her that yes, I had, which was true. I had mentioned it to my doctor at my last appointment, and he had said, with the dry brevity I appreciated about him, that I was 71 years old, with well-managed blood pressure and no other significant concerns, and that if I wanted to spend 2 weeks in a warm country, there was no medical reason I couldn't. Brett was more philosophical about it. Brett has lived in Portland for 15 years, which I think has given him a certain practiced equanimity about life choices that diverge from the conventional, and his response was something along the lines of, "That sounds genuinely interesting. What do you know about the place so far?" I told him everything I'd read over the past month, and he asked good questions and didn't editorialize, and by the end of our conversation had sent me a link to a travel account he'd found about the island I was flying to, which was his way of saying he was on board. Jess, who had started all of this, who had sent me the links and made me promise to actually look, called me the night before my flight, anxious in a way she hadn't been when this was still just a suggestion she was making, rather than a thing that was actually happening. She made me promise to text her when I landed. She made me save Gary's phone number in my phone before I left. She asked whether I had enough of my medications packed to cover me for the full 2 weeks, plus some buffer, in case anything went sideways with the travel schedule. I told her yes, yes, and yes, and she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "I just need you to be okay over there, Dad." And I told her that was precisely the point of going, to find out whether being okay over there was something that was actually available to me, and to come home knowing the honest answer. I landed in Cebu, connected to a smaller flight down to Dumaguete, and walked out of that small airport into heat and light, and a quality of air that was warm and salt-touched, and entirely unlike any air I had ever stood in before, and something in my chest that had been tight for longer than I could accurately identify, released a small, perceptible amount. Not dramatically, not the way it happens in movies, where arriving somewhere new is accompanied by music and a changed expression and the clear sense of a corner turning. Just a small, quiet release, the kind you notice afterward, more than in the moment. Gary was waiting at arrivals in a polo shirt with the sleeves rolled up, holding a handwritten sign with my name on it that I later learned he did for every first-timer he picked up, as a joke that only worked if you also happened to find it genuinely welcoming, which I did. He was a broad-shouldered man, with the specific ease of someone who has arranged his life to include the things that actually suit him, and has had several years now to settle into the arrangement. And he drove me through the city on the way to the small guest house where I was staying, and narrated it with the unself-conscious love of a man who has genuinely stopped taking the place for granted even after 4 years. The Rizal Boulevard running along the waterfront, the boulevard lined with benches and coconut trees, where in the evenings, he told me, half the city seemed to come out to walk, couples and families and old men and students, all together in the cooling air. The market where he bought his produce, 3 mornings a week, open air, covered, dense with color and noise, where, for the equivalent of $8 or $9 American dollars, you could fill a bag with more fresh vegetables and fruit than you'd reasonably use before it turned. The small restaurants, called carinderias, where you ate whatever was available that day, displayed in trays behind a glass counter, and where for the equivalent of $1.50 to $2, you ate a meal with rice that was fresh and real in a way that the food I had been preparing alone in Ohio had ceased to be for longer than I cared to calculate. He took me on my second day to meet a small group of expats who gathered most mornings at a coffee place near the waterfront, a loose, informal community of men and a few women, mostly retirees, several Americans but also Australians and Europeans, and one Canadian who had apparently been there longer than anyone else and whose perspective on life in the city had the authority of deep time. I sat with those people for 3 hours that first morning, not saying much, mostly listening, and what I was listening for, underneath the specific practical information about visa renewals and recommended tailors and the name of the best mechanic, was whether these were people who had settled, in the diminished sense of having accepted less than they'd hoped for, or whether they were people who had arrived somewhere that was genuinely working for them. I was listening for the specific, unmistakable register of a life that is actually being lived rather than endured. And what I heard, that morning and on every subsequent morning I spent in that company, was unmistakably the second thing. A man named Dennis, 66 years old, formerly a high school history teacher from Sacramento, had been in Dumaguete for 3 years. He was not a wealthy man. He was, he told me without embarrassment, living on Social Security alone, $1,140 a month, and he was living, by what he described and by what I could see of his actual daily life over the days I was there, comfortably. His apartment was clean and light, on the second floor of a building 2 blocks from the boulevard, with a ceiling fan he ran instead of air conditioning for most of the day, because the coastal breeze made it sufficient, and his monthly rent was the equivalent of $230. He ate well. He had friends who he saw daily. He had a standing game of chess with a retired Filipino professor named Ernesto, who he had met at the park on the boulevard, and who had, over 3 years, become what Dennis described as the best friend he had made in his adult life. At an age and stage when most men's friend groups were doing nothing but contracting. Dennis walked me to the public market on my 3rd day and walked me through it the way a man walks through a place he knows completely. No tourist performance, just the actual task of buying what he needed for the week. And I stood at stall after stall, watching him pay for things in amounts that required me to recalculate multiple times because the numbers were simply hard to believe. A kilo of fresh tomatoes for the equivalent of 40 American cents. A whole fresh fish, the kind you'd pay $14 for at a grocery counter in Columbus, for somewhere between $1.50 and $2, depending on the type. A bunch of bananas for 30 cents. Not inferior versions of these things, just these things, fresh, available, real, at prices that reflected a local economy rather than an American retail markup structure that had spent 40 years finding new ways to capture margin between a farm and a consumer. I ate at a carinderia near the guest house on my 4th evening, alone, for the first time without Gary or Dennis or someone else to translate the process for me, because I had been watching it done enough times that I thought I understood the mechanics. You walk in, you look at what's in the trays, you point at what you want, you say the word for rice, which is kanin, and which Gary had made me practice until I could say it, without obviously asking whether I was saying it correctly. The woman behind the counter was in her 50s, small, with the brisk efficiency of someone who has performed this exact transaction 10,000 times and expects it to go smoothly. I pointed. She served. I paid the equivalent of $1.80 for a plate of pork adobo and rice that I ate at a plastic table with a small electric fan oscillating nearby. And it was one of the best meals I had eaten in years, not because of any particular culinary sophistication, but because of the quality of the ingredients and the specific pleasure of eating something that someone made with real attention rather than something I had half-heartedly assembled alone in a kitchen in Ohio at 6:30 in the evening because I needed to eat something. By the end of the first week, I had fallen into something resembling a routine, which I recognized as significant, because falling into a routine in a new place requires finding things worth doing repeatedly, and I had found several. Morning coffee on the boulevard, market with Dennis on market mornings, an afternoon walk that I kept extending as I got more comfortable with the streets and started recognizing faces along the route, an evening walk back to the boulevard to watch what Gary had accurately described, half the city coming out in the cooling air to occupy the waterfront with the cheerful, unhurried communalism of a place where public space is genuinely used and genuinely shared. On my second weekend, Gary took me to a gathering at the home of a Filipino couple, Rodrigo and Marisol, who hosted an open Sunday lunch a couple of times a month for a mix of their local friends and the expat community they'd gradually absorbed over the years since Rodrigo, a retired engineer who'd worked for decades in the Middle East, had come home to Dumaguete and found he liked having foreign neighbors. The food was extraordinary and came in quantities that suggested the purpose of the occasion was partly the food itself. A whole roasted pig, called lechon, that I had been warned about by Gary, and which lived entirely up to everything he'd said, plus rice dishes and vegetable dishes, and a fish soup that Marisol called sinigang, and that I ate 2 bowls of while she watched me from across the room with the specific satisfaction of a person watching someone discover something wonderful for the first time. I sat next to Rodrigo for much of that afternoon, and we talked the way 2 men in their 70s can talk when neither of them is performing anything, honestly, about what retirement was supposed to have looked like and what it actually looked like, about the particular strangeness of a life built for a career and a family discovering itself to have a second act that nobody had really planned or prepared for. Rodrigo had come back from years working abroad, to a country he still deeply felt was home, but to a retired life that had needed deliberate construction, effort, the building of new purposes to replace the old ones that work had provided. He had done that construction over several years and was clearly glad he had, and listening to him describe it, I recognized the outline of what I was trying to do, or trying to figure out how to do, and it helped to hear that it was something that could be figured out, that it was not a thing you either had naturally or didn't. I flew home at the end of the 2 weeks and I sat in the Columbus airport, waiting for my connection to be called, and I looked around at the terminal with the fresh eyes you sometimes get after time, somewhere completely different, and what I saw was a large, cold, efficiently organized space in which everyone was managing themselves at significant distance from everyone else, and that was fine. That was appropriate for an airport. But I thought about the boulevard in Dumaguete in the evening, and the Sunday lunch at Rodrigo and Marisol's house, and the specific quality of the morning coffee hour at the waterfront, where the conversation ranged from completely trivial to surprisingly genuine, without anyone seeming to mark the transition. And I thought, clearly, without needing to run any more numbers or read any more forum threads, that I was going back, and that this time I was not coming back. Telling my children was a different proposition from the trip, because the trip had been 2 weeks, and this was the rest of whatever life I had. I called them all the same evening, in sequence, starting with Jess because she was the reason I'd gone in the first place, and I thought she deserved to hear it first. She was quiet when I told her, not a worried quiet, but a processing quiet, the kind that eventually resolved into, okay, tell me what the plan actually is. I told her the whole plan, in detail, because I'd been building it during the flight home and had most of the pieces already assembled in my head. The visa process, the international health insurance I'd already identified and was going to apply for the following week. The apartment search Gary had offered to help with remotely once I had a general budget and neighborhood in mind. The $10,000 bank deposit requirement. The timeline, which was roughly 4 months out, long enough to get the house on the market and work through the practical logistics, without being so long that I'd find a reason to stall indefinitely, which I was fully capable of doing if I gave myself too much runway. Melissa asked more questions than Jess did, detailed and specific, and I had detailed and specific answers for all of them, and when she ran out of questions that I couldn't answer, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "You really thought this through," with a tone that was partly acknowledging the thoroughness, and partly still slightly wary. The wariness of a daughter who loves her father, and whose version of love has always expressed itself through concern about practical adequacy. I told her that I had thought this through more carefully than I had thought through most things in my adult life, and that was not an exaggeration. Brett asked me, at some point in our conversation, whether I was scared, and I told him the truth, which was that I was more scared of the specific future I was looking at in Ohio, the numbers running down, the dinners alone, the furnaces failing on the coldest night of November, than I was of whatever learning curve was waiting for me on the other side of the decision I was making. He said he thought that was probably the right way to think about it. I told him I thought so too. I sold the house faster than I'd expected, which in retrospect I should have anticipated, since the Columbus real estate market was doing what real estate markets had been doing everywhere, being aggressive and fast. I had 3 weeks between accepting an offer and handing over the keys, which meant 3 weeks of sorting through 31 years of accumulated life, of deciding what traveled with me and what stayed behind. That process was harder than I had expected, even accounting for the fact that I had expected it to be hard. Not because of any dramatic artifacts, no deathbed mementos or anything so stark, but because of the sheer, accumulated ordinariness of a life in one place, a drawer full of manuals for appliances I'd thrown away a decade ago, a box of Christmas cards dating back to the early 90s that I hadn't known I'd kept, a shelf of books I'd been meaning to read for years and clearly wasn't going to now, and had to admit, finally, were never going to get read. I kept less than I thought I would. 2 suitcases and a carry-on turned out to be a clarifying constraint, not a painful one, because when you have to choose what actually matters down to a number of items that fit in a certain amount of luggage, the things that actually matter become fairly obvious fairly quickly. Photographs in digital form, a few things that belonged to my parents, medications and the documents that mattered, the visa application materials, the insurance documents, the banking records, the folder of papers that Jess had made me organize and copy and scan before she would sign off on the timeline. I drove to Cincinnati to spend 3 days with Melissa before I left, and to Portland to spend 4 days with Brett, and Jess came to Columbus for my last week and helped me with the final logistics and drove me to the airport on the morning of my flight. She hugged me in the departures drop-off lane in a way that lasted longer than either of us had planned, and she said, her voice not entirely steady, "I'm going to need you to text me when you land." And I told her I would, and that it would probably be a strange time of day in Ohio when it came through, and she said she didn't care and to send it anyway, and I told her I loved her and got out of the car. I landed in Cebu on a Thursday evening and connected down to Dumaguete, and when I walked out of that small airport for the second time, Gary was not there with a handwritten sign this time, because I had not needed him to come. I had already arranged my own transportation. I already knew the route to the apartment that had been set up and waiting for me. And that small fact, the unremarkable fact of knowing how to get from the airport to my own home, felt significant in a way I hadn't quite anticipated. I put my bags in the car, and we drove through the city, and I watched streets I now recognized go past the window, and I thought, quietly, without saying it to anyone, because there was no one to say it to in that car, who would have known what I meant, that I had done the thing, the actual thing, and it had worked. The apartment was on the 2nd floor of a well-maintained building in a residential neighborhood, about 10 minutes' walk from the boulevard. A living room with actual furniture, a small kitchen, one bedroom that was larger than I'd expected from the photographs, a bathroom with reliable hot water, a small balcony where I could sit in the mornings with coffee and hear the neighborhood below waking up, motorbikes, vendors calling, a rooster in a yard somewhere nearby that seemed to have no reliable schedule but showed up at intervals throughout the day as if making a point about the fundamental irregularity of things. The monthly rent was 17,200 pesos. At the exchange rate the day I moved in, that was $309. I sat in that living room, on that first evening, in a place that was genuinely mine and that I had genuinely chosen, with a life I had genuinely built rather than inherited or stumbled into, and I ate takeout I'd picked up from a carinderia on the way from the airport, and I thought, running the numbers one more time the way I apparently cannot stop doing, that my total monthly expenditures in this apartment, rent, food, utilities, insurance, medications, a modest amount for the miscellaneous ordinary expenses of a life being lived, was going to come in somewhere between $850 and $950 a month. On $1,400 a month, that left me $450 to $550 every single month that I did not need to spend. After years of running deficits, after the furnace and the property taxes and the utilities and the slow, steady bleeding of savings that had been the financial texture of my life in Westerville, I had a surplus, a genuine, regular, reliable surplus. I did not weep. I am not a man who weeps easily. But I sat in that apartment with a plate of rice and pork on my lap, and I allowed myself to feel something that I had not felt in years, which was that I was going to be fine, not in the tight, managing, barely adequate sense of fine that I had been aspiring to in Ohio, but actually fine, in the sense of someone for whom the future is not an approaching problem to be worried about, but an available space to do something with. The first months had their difficulties, and I want to be honest about that, because a script that skips over the actual learning curve of moving abroad at 71 would be doing you a disservice. My Tagalog was non-existent when I arrived, and Dumaguete is Visayan speaking primarily, Cebuano, which is a different language from Tagalog, and which I was even less prepared for. Most people in the city spoke enough English for basic communication, and the expat community and the educated local professionals were fluent. But the market, the carinderia, the small everyday transactions of neighborhood life, those required patience and gesture and repetition and a willingness to look temporarily foolish, which I had to actively work at accepting since I had spent 31 years in a professional context where competence was the baseline expectation, and looking temporarily foolish was not a thing I had a lot of practice with. The heat required adjustment. Not Dumaguete's heat, specifically, which is tempered by the coastal setting and is genuinely milder than the northern parts of the country, but the basic fact of being warm every day, not uncomfortably so, but persistently, in a way that Ohio, in any month between October and April, had never been. I drank more water than I had ever drunk in my life, and still felt, for the first few weeks, slightly behind on hydration, in a way that took until about the 6-week mark to fully equilibrate. I got lost in the market, twice, not spatially but transactionally, buying things I hadn't intended to buy because I had misunderstood the pricing structure, or pointed at the wrong item, or simply failed to anticipate the particular social dynamics of. Thank you for sticking with me through all of that. I know it's a lot to take in, and I know these stories ask more of your time than most of what's out there, but I hope it was worth it, and I hope some part of it stays with you longer than the length of this video does. If you want more stories like this one, told the same honest way, go ahead and hit that subscribe button because there's plenty more where this came from, and I think if this one landed, you'll want to hear where the rest of them go too. Take care of yourself. I'll see you in the next one.